The walls of a prison carry more than echoes. They hold secrets that refuse to stay buried. One man's final request, dismissed at first as strange, would ignite a chain of revelations powerful enough to shatter the certainty of guilt and expose what had been hidden for years. Subscribe now to follow stories that dig beneath the surface. Hit like if you believe in justice that fights back, and share in the comments where you're watching from. Malcolm Carter, a black man wrongfully convicted, sat on the edge of his prison cot with execution only hours away. Instead of asking for a last meal or a phone call, he stunned the warden by requesting to see his dog, Shadow, one final time. Malcolm Carter had grown accustomed to the sound of steel doors slamming and the endless rhythm of boots striking concrete. Yet on this morning, every noise seemed heavier, pressing down on him with the inevitability of what lay ahead. The penitentiary had a way of stealing time, of stretching days into years and years into a blur, but this day was different because it had been marked long ago as his final one. He had endured 7 years on death row, maintaining his innocence, watching as appeals faded one by one until all that was left was silence. Inmates around him often faced their last hours with desperation, bargaining for forgiveness or begging for another chance. Malcolm faced his with a stillness that unsettled even the guards who had watched him daily. He carried himself with dignity, shoulders squared, eyes steady, as if the truth he carried within him would not allow him to collapse, even in the face of death. The warden had seen men beg for extravagant meals, request bottles of liquor, ask for a television set, or demand letters be sent to families that had long abandoned them. Malcolm's request was different, simple yet profound. When he raised his head and said, "I want to see my dog," the room stilled as though the prison itself had inhaled. At first, the officers present thought he was joking, a strange attempt to bring humor to the bleakness of his final hours, but his face bore no smile. He was deadly serious. The warden narrowed his eyes, questioning the purpose. "Why your dog?" he asked. Malcolm's answer was steady, his voice low but clear. "Because Shadow never judged me. Before the arrest, before the trial, before the world called me guilty, he stood by me. He is the only one who knows me as I am, not what they say I am." The guards shifted uncomfortably. They had never seen a condemned man speak with such quiet honesty. Some rolled their eyes, muttering about protocol and security risks. Others looked at Malcolm with something resembling respect. The older officer, Daniels, broke the silence with a quiet observation. "He's got no visitors, no family, no one writing letters. Maybe this is all he has left." The warden leaned back, conflicted. A dog in a maximum security prison was unheard of, especially on execution day. Yet Malcolm had lived 7 years without incident, no fights, no escape attempts, no infractions to his name. His record was cleaner than most men on the outside. The warden tapped his pen against the file before him, weighing the risk against the man's dignity. After what felt like an eternity, he finally nodded. 10 minutes, he said. In the yard, under strict supervision. The words carried across the prison within hours. Some guards laughed it off, dismissing the request as ridiculous. Others whispered about it in hushed tones, marveling at the bond between a man and his dog. Malcolm himself sat quietly in his cell, heart pounding not from fear of death, but from anticipation of seeing the one creature who had never betrayed him. That night he lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling above him, recalling memories of Shadow bounding through tall grass, chasing sticks, and curling up at the foot of his bed on nights when the weight of the world felt too heavy. He remembered Shadow's steady breathing, the warmth that reminded him he wasn't alone. Now, after years of silence and isolation, he wondered if Shadow would still remember him, if the years apart had dulled the bond they once shared. Yet deep inside, Malcolm knew loyalty like that never faded. The guards on duty that evening couldn't help but notice his calmness. They had seen condemned men break down, weep uncontrollably, lash out in violence, or shut down entirely. Malcolm was different. He sat with his back straight, his breathing steady, as if preparing for something greater than death. In the small hours before dawn, Daniels walked past the cell and paused. "You really think the dog will come?" he asked softly. Malcolm met his gaze through the bars. "He will," he replied. "He's been waiting, just like me." There was no tremor in his voice, only certainty. Daniels shook his head slowly, moved more than he cared to admit. At sunrise, when the first light cut across the yard, the arrangements were set in motion. Malcolm was escorted out under heavy guard, his wrists loosely bound in front of him, a symbolic restraint more than a practical one given how calm he was. Other inmates pressed against the bars of their windows, watching the strange procession unfold, murmuring among themselves about what could possibly be happening. Word had spread. Malcolm Carter was going to see his dog. The guards flanked him on both sides, yet Malcolm hardly noticed them. His eyes were fixed on the far gate, his chest tight with anticipation. For years he had been stripped of every human comfort, but in a few minutes he would see the one soul who had never abandoned him. The prison yard, usually filled with shouting, ball games, and the dull roar of voices, stood silent as if the weight of the moment demanded respect. Even the wind seemed to hush. The steel gate creaked open and every muscle in Malcolm's body tightened. Beyond the threshold, a black and tan German shepherd stepped forward, his coat gleaming under the pale light, his ears pricked, his eyes scanning until they landed on the man kneeling in the yard. Shadow. Malcolm felt his breath catch. It had been years, but in that instant he recognized every detail, the gray creeping into the muzzle, the slight stiffness in the gait, the unwavering light in his eyes. The leash slackened, and Shadow surged forward, tail whipping furiously as he closed the distance. Malcolm dropped to his knees, arms outstretched. The dog barreled into him, pressing his head against Malcolm's chest, whining with a sound caught between joy and grief. For a moment, time stopped. There was no prison, no countdown, no sentence. There was only a man and his dog reunited after years of separation. Malcolm buried his face in Shadow's fur, inhaling the familiar scent of earth and warmth. Tears slipped from his eyes, but they were not of despair, they were of homecoming. In those moments, Malcolm Carter was no longer an inmate awaiting execution. He was a man who had found the one piece of truth left in his life, loyalty that outlasted betrayal. The morning air still carried the echo of Shadow's reunion with Malcolm Carter, and though the moment had softened the hardest of guards, reality quickly reasserted itself. Malcolm was still a man on death row, and the decision to allow his dog into the prison yard had stirred debates in offices, control rooms, and quiet corners of the penitentiary. Warden Hayes, a man who prided himself on maintaining order at all costs, found himself confronted by a staff divided in opinion. Some officers viewed the act as a dangerous precedent, something that blurred the line between justice and sentimentality. Others, especially those who had watched Malcolm live quietly for 7 years without incident, believed the gesture was long overdue. Hayes sat in his office, the blinds drawn against the glare of the morning sun, rereading Malcolm's file for the third time that day. Every page painted the same picture. No fights, no contraband, no disciplinary issues, nothing but a man who lived with patience and dignity. In the personal notes section, written in neat script by the arresting officers years ago, was one simple line: owned a German shepherd named Shadow. The warden tapped his pen against that line, uneasy with the thought that such a detail, dismissed at the time as trivial, had become the hinge on which this man's last hours turned. In the control room, the argument grew heated. Officer Burke, a broad-shouldered man who believed rules were carved in stone, shook his head. "This is a maximum security facility. We're not a petting zoo. You think it's wise to bring a dog in here? What happens if the animal bites someone, or worse, if Carter uses him as a distraction to make a move?" His words carried authority, but they were met with resistance. Officer Daniels, the same man who had spoken softly in Carter's defense before, raised a hand. "You know as well as I do, he's never once broken the rules. He hasn't raised his voice, hasn't lifted a hand to anyone. This isn't about a distraction, this is about letting a man go out with dignity." The room quieted, and all eyes turned to Hayes when he entered. His gaze swept across his officers, men and women who had dedicated their lives to enforcing order. "We've granted the request," he announced firmly. "It will be carried out under strict supervision. 10 minutes in the yard, no more. Carter has earned that much." His tone left little room for argument, but muttering persisted even after he left. The prison was a machine, every cog turning with rigid precision, and now a dog had been thrust into its gears. Yet, as the hours passed, the story spread through the prison population like wildfire. Inmates pressed their faces against bars, whispering to one another about the condemned man who would see his dog before dying. Some scoffed, saying Carter was no different from anyone else. Others envied him, longing for the chance to feel the touch of someone or something that reminded them of life outside. Malcolm himself sat in his cell, Shadow curled at his feet, permitted to stay until the next morning. The guards had expected him to break down with joy, but instead he sat quietly, stroking the dog's fur with the same patience that had marked his years behind bars. In that silence, Daniels leaned against the wall, studying the man he had guarded for years. "You know," he said softly, "most men ask for food or whiskey. You ask for a dog. Why?" Malcolm's hand paused for a moment on Shadow's back, then continued its slow rhythm. "Because food fills your stomach for a moment. Whiskey dulls your mind for an hour. But this?" He gestured to Shadow, who pressed closer against him. "This is truth. Truth doesn't fade when the clock runs out." Daniel said nothing more, but the words stayed with him. Later that night, as the lights dimmed and the prison sank into restless, quiet, arguments reignited among the guards in the mess hall. Burke leaned forward, voice low but sharp. "You all think this is noble, but mark my words, it'll come back to bite us. Dogs smell fear, yes, but they also stir emotions. Emotions lead to mistakes," Daniels countered, "or maybe emotions lead to truth." The two men locked eyes, their disagreement deeper than procedure. Elsewhere in the prison, Hayes received a call from the district attorney's office. The case, though technically closed, had always carried questions that unsettled those who had dug deeper than the headlines. Hayes listened, nodding slowly as the caller reminded him that Malcolm's record on the inside was far more consistent with innocence than guilt. Hayes hung up without answering, staring at the folder on his desk, wondering if he had just opened a door that could never be shut again. At dawn, when Malcolm was escorted back into the yard for the promised 10 minutes, the staff gathered in numbers far greater than required. They weren't there for security, they were there because something about this moment had captured their curiosity. Shadow trotted beside him, leashed but straining forward, eager to be free. As Malcolm knelt once more, whispering to his companion, the crowd of onlookers shifted. For a heartbeat, the entire penitentiary seemed suspended, united by the sight of loyalty unbroken by years or walls. It was then that Shadow froze again, hackles rising, eyes locked on something unseen. The prison yard lay under a pale morning light, its concrete expanse ringed by steel fences and watchtowers where rifles glinted in the sun, and the air carried a stillness that felt unnatural for a place usually filled with shouts and heavy footsteps. Every inmate who could catch a glimpse pressed against their small windows, and every guard stationed around the yard kept their hands near their belts, as though expecting trouble even though the condemned man in their custody had given them none for years. Malcolm Carter walked with a calm that unnerved the men flanking him, his wrists loosely cuffed in front of him, not as a sign of danger, but as a reminder that he was still a prisoner hours away from his scheduled execution. His eyes were fixed on the gate at the far end, and though his body carried the fatigue of 7 years on death row, his steps gained purpose the closer he drew. For Malcolm, this was not about ritual or spectacle. It was about reclaiming a part of himself that the system had stripped away, the part that had survived the trial, the sentence, and the endless nights of despair. On the other side of the yard, officers tugged open the gate, and a black and tan German shepherd trotted in, his coat shining in the morning sun despite the gray creeping into his muzzle. Shadow lifted his head high, ears pricked, scanning the yard until his eyes locked on the kneeling figure waiting for him. For a split second, the dog froze, as though confirming what his senses told him, then surged forward with a force that startled even the guards holding the leash. The officers glanced at Warden Hayes for confirmation, and with a tight nod, he allowed the leash to slacken. Shadow bounded across the yard, paws striking the ground like drums, tail whipping behind him in a blur of emotion. Malcolm dropped to his knees just as Shadow collided into him, pressing his head against Malcolm's chest, whining with a sound that broke through the silence like a hymn of grief and joy intertwined. Malcolm's arms wrapped tightly around his companion, his fingers sinking into thick fur as his face pressed against the familiar scent of earth and leather and home. He whispered words that only Shadow could hear, fragments of memory and promises carried through years of solitude, and for that moment the walls and guards and sentence fell away. The prison ceased to exist, replaced by the simple truth of reunion between a man and his dog. Guards who had once scoffed at the request now found themselves shifting uncomfortably, their throats tight as they watched the raw display of loyalty, while some blinked against the sting of tears they would never admit to. Warden Hayes, watching from the tower, leaned forward with a frown not born of disapproval but of realization, because what he witnessed was no trivial request granted for the sake of mercy. It was proof of a bond that time, distance, and injustice could not break. Malcolm spoke softly, his voice steady despite the tears streaking his cheeks. "You waited for me, boy. You never forgot," Shadow answered with a low whine, licking the man's hands as though to confirm that memory and love had never faded. Around them, the yard remained still, officers too moved to interrupt, inmates too transfixed to jeer, and for once the prison felt more like a chapel than a cage. Yet beneath the beauty of reunion, another undercurrent began to stir. As Malcolm continued to stroke Shadow's fur, he felt the dog's body tense. The wagging tail slowed, the ears swiveled, and a deep vibration rose from Shadow's chest. His growl was not a warning given lightly, it was instinct born of years of protection, and Malcolm, who knew every nuance of his companion's behavior, stiffened as he followed the line of Shadow's gaze. At the far side of the yard, standing with his hands clasped tightly behind his back, was Officer Briggs. The man's posture was rigid, his jaw clenched, and though his eyes avoided Malcolm's, Shadow's stare never wavered. The growl deepened, rolling like distant thunder, and the silence of the yard grew heavier as guards shifted uneasily, unsure of what was unfolding. One muttered for Malcolm to control his dog, but Malcolm kept his hand steady on Shadow's back, whispering, "Easy, boy, easy." His voice was calm, but inside his mind raced. Shadow had never growled without reason. In all the years they had lived together before the arrest, Shadow had shown warmth to neighbors, to children on the street, even to strangers who passed their gate, but when danger approached, his warning was unmistakable. Malcolm knew without doubt that the dog was reacting to something real, something hidden beneath the rigid stance of the officer at the gate. Officer Daniels, standing nearby, noticed the tension too, his eyes narrowing as he watched Briggs shift slightly under the intensity of the dog's gaze. Daniels leaned closer to Malcolm, his words barely audible. "Your dog's got a good nose. He doesn't growl at nothing. What's his problem with Briggs?" Malcolm didn't answer, not out of defiance, but out of careful calculation. The yard had returned to its routine hum by the afternoon, but the memory of Shadow's growl lingered in the minds of every man who had witnessed it, and for Malcolm Carter, the sound reverberated with more weight than any sermon or sentence ever had, because he knew Shadow did not growl without cause. And though the officers dismissed it as an animal's instinct, Malcolm understood it as a sign, a warning that something was deeply wrong, and the wrongness had a name: Officer Briggs. The dog had locked on him with eyes unblinking, the growl sharp and guttural, and Briggs had flinched, though he tried to mask it with rigid posture and hurried departure. But even a moment of avoidance was enough for Malcolm to recognize fear when he saw it, and the fear in Briggs was not the fear of a dog's teeth, but the fear of being exposed. In his cell that night, Malcolm lay awake, Shadow curled protectively by his side, ears twitching at every sound beyond the bars, and Malcolm let his fingers trace the fur along the dog's back, while his mind replayed every detail of Briggs's presence at the yard, from the way his jaw tightened to the way his eyes darted away from the warden's tower, and he thought back to the night of his arrest, the flashing red and blue lights, the shouts, the hurried commands, and how Briggs had appeared then too, though the reports had never recorded it, and memory collided with suspicion until the truth began to take shape in his mind. Officer Daniels, lingering outside the cell with arms crossed, broke the silence when he said, "That dog doesn't act up for nothing. I've seen him before calm as a lamb, but today he went at Briggs like the man was poison. You ever see him act like that back home?" Malcolm shook his head slowly. Shadow doesn't lie. If he growled at Briggs, there's a reason. Daniels leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Funny thing, Briggs was around the night they brought you in. I remember hearing his name mentioned once, but when I looked at the paperwork later, there was no trace of it. You think he left it out by accident?" The implication hung heavy in the stale prison air. Malcolm said nothing, but his silence was confirmation enough for Daniels to frown deeply, suspicion now rooted where before there had been only duty. The next morning, Malcolm was escorted again to the yard, Shadow leashed tightly yet straining forward as if driven by memory, and the other officers kept their distance, whispering about the condemned man whose last hours seemed to grow stranger with each passing moment. Briggs stood near the far gate again, his stance tense, his eyes narrowed, and when Shadow saw him, the growl returned instantly, louder this time, teeth bared in a snarl that echoed across the yard. The guards shifted uneasily, some reaching for batons, others glancing toward the warden's tower for instruction, but Malcolm raised a hand, his calmness unnerving them. "He knows something," Malcolm said firmly. The warden's voice barked down from above, demanding to know the cause of the disturbance, but no one answered, and in the silence, Shadow's warning grew impossible to ignore. Briggs finally turned on his heel and stalked away, his shoulders stiff, his jaw locked, and the growl subsided only when he vanished from sight. Later that afternoon, Malcolm was summoned unexpectedly to a small interview room, Shadow allowed to remain at his side under Daniel's watch. Warden Hayes sat at the table, his expression a mixture of irritation and curiosity, and across from him stood Briggs, stiff and cold, hands clasped behind his back like a soldier at attention. The warden's eyes flicked between the two men, then settled on Briggs. "Why didn't you disclose that you were at the scene of Carter's arrest?" Briggs's jaw tightened. "Didn't think it mattered. I was off duty, just passing by." His voice was clipped, rehearsed, and unconvincing. Shadow erupted in a sharp bark that rattled the walls, his body tense, his eyes locked on Briggs with unrelenting focus. The growl rolled like thunder in the cramped room, and Briggs's mask of composure cracked for the briefest instant. Daniel stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Briggs. "That's funny, because a witness just came forward, swearing they saw someone matching your description leaving Carter's house right before the police arrived. Care to explain that?" Silence filled the room, the kind that suffocated, and the warden's expression darkened with suspicion. Malcolm sat still, his hand resting on Shadow's back, his mind racing but his face calm. For years he had shouted his innocence into deaf ears, but now his dog's growl spoke louder than his words ever could. The warden's next words cut through the tension with the force of a gavel. "Effective immediately, the execution is delayed. We are reopening the case." Briggs's glare burned with fury, but it no longer mattered. The path toward truth had cracked open, and Shadow had lit the way. The interview room remained heavy with tension long after Officer Briggs had been escorted out, and Malcolm Carter sat in the hard steel chair with Shadow pressed against his leg, the dog's ears alert, his eyes still fixed on the door where Briggs had vanished. And Malcolm understood that the case against him had begun to unravel, not by legal maneuvering or courtroom speeches, but by the instinct of the one companion who had never abandoned him. Warden Hayes closed the file in front of him with a sharp snap, his mind already racing through the implications of reopening a case so close to an execution because he knew the world outside would not view this lightly. And yet the gravity in Daniels' tone and the dog's undeniable reaction gnawed at his conscience in a way that no technicality ever had. Malcolm remained silent, his hands resting on Shadow's back, but his thoughts churned with fragments of memory from that night 7 years ago, when red and blue lights had painted his street and uniformed men had swarmed his home. And among those memories, he recalled a shadowed figure leaving his property just before the police arrived, a figure he had tried to identify, but whose presence had been erased from every report. And now, with the witness Daniels mentioned and Shadow's growl confirming it, Malcolm finally had a name to attach to that ghost, Briggs. The next morning brought an unusual air inside the penitentiary because word spread quickly that Malcolm's execution had been delayed, and the inmates buzzed with theories, some claiming it was a clerical error, others whispering that new evidence had surfaced, while guards exchanged guarded glances, careful not to speak too openly about the possibility of injustice in their own halls. Malcolm walked the corridors with Shadow at his side under Daniels' supervision, and the eyes that followed him were no longer filled only with disdain or indifference, but with curiosity and something else, something like respect. For he was no longer just a man condemned to die, but the man whose dog had challenged the certainty of his guilt. Daniels pulled him aside into a quieter corner near the infirmary, his voice hushed but urgent. "Listen, Carter, you need to know this. I started digging through old duty rosters. Briggs's name shows up in the system on the night of your arrest, but then in the official report, it's gone. Someone scrubbed it. And if he was there and didn't log it, that's no mistake. That's intent. Malcolm's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. Shadow already told me Briggs was there, and he's hiding something. Daniel shook his head in disbelief, the weight of the discovery pressing on him. I don't know how far this goes, but if a guard tampered with the case, if evidence was planted, it means you were set up from the beginning. You've been sitting on death row for another man's crime. Malcolm let out a long breath, steadying himself against a surge of anger that threatened to break his composure, because anger would do nothing for him now. Only patience, truth, and Shadow's unrelenting loyalty could carry him forward. That evening, Hayes called for a formal meeting with the district attorney's office, summoning investigators into the prison to re-examine the file, and while they pored over faded photographs and crime scene notes, Shadow was brought into the room, his leash held firmly, but his gaze fixed unerringly on the evidence table, as if he too understood the weight of the moment. When Briggs's name surfaced in the discussion, the dog's growl filled the air once more, low and constant, a living reminder that instincts sometimes spoke louder than testimony. Hayes, who had once prided himself on strict adherence to procedure, found himself unsettled by the realization that perhaps he had allowed procedure to blind him to truth, and though he tried to hide it, the lines around his eyes deepened with doubt. Outside the prison walls, the news of a delayed execution began to leak, stirring reporters and advocates who had long questioned the integrity of Malcolm's conviction, and while no official statement had been given, whispers of misconduct began to circulate, putting pressure on the DA to act swiftly before the story exploded into scandal. Inside his cell, Malcolm sat quietly with Shadow curled against him, his hand moving rhythmically through the dog's fur, and he reflected on the strange path that had led him here. His last request had not been a farewell but a key, one that unlocked cracks in the foundation of the lie built against him. He thought of his mother, long gone, who had told him as a child that truth had a way of clawing its way out no matter how deep men tried to bury it, and he realized she had been right. The guards who once looked at him with contempt now studied him with unease, some even with guilt, as if they wondered whether they too had played a part in caging an innocent man. Daniels returned late that night, his voice urgent. The discovery of fingerprints that matched Briggs and not Malcolm Carter set the prison into a storm of hushed conversations, rattling the once unshakable confidence in the conviction that had condemned a black man to die. And though official orders delayed the execution, tension thickened with each passing hour because everyone inside those walls knew that what was coming next could determine not only Malcolm's fate, but the integrity of the entire system. Malcolm sat at the steel table in the small interview room, Shadow lying at his feet with his head resting on his paws, his eyes unblinking and fixed on the door, and Daniel stood in a corner, his arms crossed tightly as though bracing himself for the confrontation about to unfold. The sound of boots echoed down the hallway, and the door swung open to reveal Briggs, his face taut, his movements stiff, his eyes cold as he stepped inside. Behind him came Warden Hayes, his jaw set, his gaze unreadable, and he gestured for Briggs to take a seat opposite Malcolm. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint hum of the overhead light, until Hayes leaned forward, his voice sharp but controlled. "Officer Briggs, why didn't you disclose that you were present near Carter's home on the night of the arrest?" Briggs straightened his back, his voice clipped. "Didn't think it mattered. I wasn't on duty, I was just passing by." The lie hung in the air like smoke, accurate and transparent to anyone willing to see it for what it was. Shadow's head lifted, ears pricking forward, and then the growl began, deep and guttural, vibrating through the floor, and the dog's eyes locked on Briggs with an intensity that stripped away the man's composure. Briggs shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening, his eyes darting for a moment toward the warden before snapping back to Malcolm with a glare meant to intimidate but betrayed by the sweat gathering at his temple. Daniels pushed off the wall, his voice steady but edged with steel. "That's strange because a witness swore they saw someone matching your description leaving Carter's house minutes before police arrived. And now the prints we've re-examined point directly to you. So maybe you weren't just passing by. Maybe you were there for a reason." The words hit like blows, and Briggs's lips pressed into a thin line, his silence louder than any denial. Malcolm sat motionless, his hand resting lightly on Shadow's back, but inside, his heart pounded with a mixture of fury and vindication because for 7 years he had waited for someone to listen, and now At last, the pieces of truth were aligning. The warden's gaze was fixed on Briggs, his eyes narrowed. "I need you to explain why your name disappeared from the official report. Who erased it? Was it you?" Briggs's eyes flicked away, his silence damning. Shadow barked sharply, the sound explosive in the small room, and Briggs flinched, his hands curling into fists on the table. Daniel stepped closer, leaning over him. "You framed him, didn't you? You planted the evidence that sent him here." Briggs's face twisted, his composure breaking under the weight of accusation, and his voice finally spilled out, low and venomous. "You don't know what you're talking about." Hayes slammed a hand on the table, the sound reverberating through the room. "Enough. Your denial doesn't erase the evidence stacking against you. Until this is resolved, Carter's execution is suspended, and this case is officially reopened." Briggs's face darkened, rage flickering in his eyes, but his words stuck in his throat as two guards entered and stood behind him, ready to escort him out. Shadow's growl followed him as he left, a living reminder of the truth he could no longer bury. When the door shut, Hayes exhaled heavily, his face pale but resolute. "Carter, I can't undo what's been done to you yet, but I will not allow an innocent man to die under my watch. This investigation will move forward immediately." For the first time in years, Malcolm felt air fill his lungs like freedom itself, not because he was free, but because hope had returned. Daniels placed a hand on his shoulder, the gesture small but grounding. "This isn't over, but it's a start." Malcolm looked down at Shadow, who had settled again, his eyes bright, his loyalty unwavering, and whispered, "You saved me, boy. You saved me." Outside the interview room, whispers rippled through the corridors as word spread. The warden had delayed the execution. Briggs had been questioned, and for the first time, the possibility of Malcolm's innocence was no longer a secret muttered by a few, but a reality forcing its way into the open. The prison walls that had for 7 years contained the certainty of Malcolm Carter's guilt now echoed with doubt as news spread that the execution had been suspended and the case reopened. And though the official announcement from Warden Hayes was measured and professional, within the halls of the penitentiary it struck like thunder, for guards whispered uneasily, inmates murmured from their cells, and Malcolm himself sat in the dim light of the interview room with Shadow lying faithfully at his side, his heart pounding with a rhythm that no longer counted down to death, but now pulsed with the fragile possibility of freedom. Investigators from the district attorney's office arrived the next morning, their suits crisp, their eyes sharp, and they carried with them boxes of old evidence that had gathered dust since the trial, boxes that had been ignored once the conviction was secured. They spread crime scene photos, fingerprint cards, and witness statements across the table, and though the documents were yellowed with age, the truth they contained still breathed, waiting to be acknowledged. Malcolm was escorted in under guard, Shadow permitted to stay at his feet as a silent sentinel, and for the first time he was no longer treated as a man condemned, but as a man whose word might finally carry weight. One investigator, a woman named Pierce, lifted the fingerprint card with gloved hands and spoke firmly. "The retest is conclusive. These prints do not belong to Malcolm Carter. They belong to Officer Briggs." The words fell into the room like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock through everyone present. Hayes leaned forward, his voice grim. "Explain how this could have been overlooked." Pierce exchanged a glance with her partner before replying. "It wasn't overlooked, it was buried. The chain of custody for these prints shows irregularities, changes in documentation, signatures that don't match. Someone tampered with the evidence deliberately." Daniel, standing in the corner, clenched his fist, his suspicion of Briggs now hardened into conviction. Malcolm sat silently, his hand resting on Shadow's head, but inside his mind the memories of that night resurfaced with painful clarity. He had shouted his innocence until his throat was raw, but the court had chosen to believe the planted evidence and the missing pieces, and now those missing pieces were finally crawling back into the light. The investigators moved methodically, questioning Malcolm about the events of the night, and though his answers had not changed in 7 years, this time they listened, this time they wrote down every detail, and this time the presence of Shadow, who growled every time Briggs's name was spoken, seemed to underline the weight of his testimony. Meanwhile, Briggs himself had been placed on administrative leave, confined to quarters while internal affairs began to probe his history, and what they found only deepened the scandal. Reports from years earlier hinted at misconduct swept under the rug, unexplained gaps in duty rosters, and connections to people involved in the original case. Piece by piece, the foundation of the conviction crumbled. Inside the prison, the atmosphere shifted. Guards who had once dismissed Malcolm as another criminal now watched him with conflicted eyes, some even offering small nods of respect as he passed. Inmates whispered through the bars, some cheering him on, others bitter that his truth was surfacing while theirs remained unheard, but all recognizing that the impossible had happened. The system had admitted it might be wrong. That night, alone in his cell with Shadow curled beside him, Malcolm allowed himself to imagine life beyond the walls. He pictured walking streets without shackles, breathing air that was not rationed through steel grates, and feeling the sun on his face without a tower of rifles overhead. Yet even as hope grew, fear remained, for he knew the system did not easily confess its errors, and men like Briggs would not go down quietly. The following day, Hayes convened a formal hearing inside the prison, inviting the DA's office, internal affairs, and select guards to witness the confrontation. Briggs was brought in under escort, his uniform exchanged for plain clothes, his face pale but his eyes defiant, and when the evidence was laid before him, the fingerprint analysis, the witness statement, the irregular chain of custody, his composure began to crack. Shadow growled once more, low and steady, the sound filling the chamber like an unrelenting drumbeat of truth. The declaration that Malcolm Carter would no longer face execution had rippled through the prison like a shockwave, shifting the entire atmosphere from grim certainty to restless anticipation. And though Malcolm remained confined behind bars, his identity had transformed from a condemned man awaiting death to a symbol of the system's fallibility, a man whose truth clawed its way into the open not by lawyers or appeals, but by the loyalty of a dog who refused to forget. In the days that followed the suspension, the district attorney's investigators worked tirelessly, combing through every shred of evidence that had once been dismissed, and what they uncovered painted a damning picture not only of Officer Briggs, but of a flawed process that had allowed his deception to bury an innocent man alive. Old reports revealed contradictions, timelines that failed to align, and key witness statements that had mysteriously vanished from the record. But now, with fresh scrutiny, those missing pieces began to resurface. One witness, a neighbor who had lived near Malcolm's house at the time of the crime, had sworn she saw a man leaving the property on the night of the murder, a man whose description fit Briggs almost perfectly, yet her testimony had never been presented at trial. Another piece of evidence, the murder weapon itself, carried traces of fingerprints that had been hastily smudged in the chain of custody, yet enough partials remained for modern testing to tie them back to Briggs, and the conclusion was unavoidable. Briggs had planted the weapon, erased his own presence, and condemned an innocent man to death. Inside the prison, Warden Hayes wrestled with his conscience, pacing his office at night, realizing that his years of trust in his officers had blinded him to corruption under his very nose, and though he had always believed in the sanctity of procedure, he now understood that procedure had been manipulated, turned into a weapon against truth. His frustration grew not only at Briggs, but at himself for failing to question sooner, for letting Malcolm sit in a cell all those years with nothing but shadows and silence for company. Daniels, meanwhile, became Malcolm's quiet ally, speaking to him during nightly rounds, updating him on each new piece of evidence surfacing, and though he remained a guard in Malcolm an inmate, a bond of respect formed between them, born not of duty but of shared understanding that truth had been suffocated too long. Shadow, ever vigilant, remained by Malcolm's side, his presence both comfort and catalyst. For every time Briggs' name was mentioned, the dog's growl reverberated like living testimony, a reminder that instincts had pierced through lies long before evidence had. Briggs himself grew more isolated by the day, confined under watch while internal affairs deepened their probe, and as more facts emerged, his denials grew weaker, his anger sharper, until even his colleagues who once trusted him began to avert their eyes. He was no longer one of them. He was the man who had betrayed the badge. For Malcolm, the nights became a strange mixture of hope and dread. He lay on his cot, Shadow steady breathing beside him, imagining what freedom might feel like, the weight of open sky, the warmth of a sun not filtered by bars. Yet he also feared the possibility of disappointment, that despite mounting proof, the system would cling to his verdict, unwilling to admit error. He whispered to Shadow in the dark, confessing his fears, his dreams, and the promise that if freedom came, they would walk out together and never look back. The investigators returned one afternoon with files thick with evidence, and in the presence of Hayes, Daniels, and the DA's representatives, they laid out their findings. Briggs had not only been at the crime scene, but had a motive long overlooked: a financial dispute with the victim, one that had escalated into violence. When the confrontation ended fatally, Briggs saw an opportunity to rid himself of responsibility by shifting blame onto Malcolm, a black man living nearby whose voice carried little weight against the word of a white officer. It was an ugly truth, one that spoke not only of personal corruption, but of systemic bias that had allowed such a lie to thrive. And Malcolm listened in silence as each detail was spoken, his dignity unbroken even as the anger simmered beneath his calm exterior. Hayes finally spoke, his voice low but resolute. "This prison nearly executed an innocent man because one of our own twisted the law. I will not allow this to be buried any longer. Carter, you will have your day to clear your name fully, and Briggs will answer for his crimes." Briggs, seated across the table under guard, sneered but offered no defense. His eyes flicked toward Malcolm with hatred, but it was the gaze of a man cornered, stripped of the authority he had once wielded. Shadow rose to his feet, hackles bristling, and let out another guttural growl, as though pronouncing judgment before any court could. Daniels leaned in toward Briggs, his words sharp. "You stole 7 years of this man's life. You tried to kill him with your lies. But it ends here." Briggs's silence was louder than words, and his composure cracked as sweat rolled down his temples. The room felt charged, as though truth itself had entered, undeniable and unstoppable. That night, when Malcolm returned to his cell, the other inmates banged on their doors, shouting words of encouragement, their voices echoing down the block. The day Briggs was formally charged dawned gray and heavy, as though the sky itself bore the weight of what was about to unfold. And inside the penitentiary, the atmosphere shifted from suspicion to certainty as the evidence that had been mounting finally collapsed, the fragile wall of lies that had imprisoned Malcolm Carter for 7 long years. The DA's office issued the warrant, officers from Internal Affairs placed Briggs in cuffs, and the irony of a once proud guard being escorted through the same gates he had walked with authority was not lost on anyone. Inmates pressed against their bars to catch a glimpse, their shouts echoing down the corridors, some jeering, others cheering, all recognizing that a man who had condemned another unjustly now wore the same shackles. Malcolm sat quietly in his cell, Shadow curled protectively at his side, and though the noise of the prison roared around him, he let his thoughts center on the meaning of this moment, for while Briggs's arrest did not yet grant him freedom, it was the clearest sign that justice had finally begun to turn. Warden Hayes entered the cell block later that morning, his expression grave but not cold, and he paused at Malcolm's bars, speaking with the respect he had withheld for years. "The prosecution has dropped all charges against you. The conviction has been vacated. Briggs will stand trial for the murder." The words fell like a hammer striking chains, and Malcolm felt his chest swell with a breath that seemed to expand beyond the narrow confines of the cell. Shadow barked once, sharp and clear, as if echoing the announcement. Daniels, standing a few steps behind, allowed himself a small nod, the corners of his mouth lifting in the faintest trace of a smile, a sign of solidarity forged in the crucible of truth. Yet, despite the relief, Malcolm's mind did not leap to celebration but to the years lost, the nights wasted in darkness, the dignity eroded by a system that had treated him as disposable. He thought of his mother, who had died while he sat in this cell, never seeing her son vindicated. He thought of the community that had whispered his guilt because it was easier to believe the word of an officer than the plea of a black man. The bitterness rose, but he swallowed it down, because this was not the time for rage. This was the time to step carefully into a future he had thought forever denied. Hours later, he was escorted to the prison gates, no longer under the label of condemned, no longer under the threat of execution, but as a man being released after wrongful conviction. Reporters had gathered beyond the fences, their cameras flashing, their voices calling out questions that blurred together in a cacophony of curiosity and opportunism. Malcolm ignored them all, his focus fixed on the feel of Shadow's fur beneath his hand, the weight of the leash in his grip, the sound of paws striking gravel as they walked in unison toward the open world. Every step felt surreal, like stepping into a dream he had clung to but never truly believed he would touch. The air was sharper, freer, unfiltered by bars or grates, and the sunlight cut across his skin with a warmth he had almost forgotten. Daniels, who had insisted on escorting him to the gate, placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Don't waste this, Carter. Live free. Prove to them all that you are worth believing in." Malcolm met his gaze, nodding with quiet resolve. "I'll prove it," he said simply, and the words carried more weight than a speech ever could. Beyond the gates, supporters had gathered, strangers who had followed his story, activists who had fought quietly for justice, and neighbors who had once doubted him now stood with signs calling for accountability. Malcolm paused, overwhelmed by the sight, and bent to kneel beside Shadow. He pressed his forehead against the dog's head, whispering, "We made it, boy. We made it." Shadow wagged his tail furiously, his eyes bright with recognition of victory, and for Malcolm the moment crystallized. He was free not because of the system, but despite it, because a dog's loyalty had exposed the lies men tried to bury. That night, settled in a small safe house provided by advocates, Malcolm sat by the window with Shadow at his feet, staring out at the city lights he had not seen in years. He thought of the countless men still behind bars, some guilty, some innocent, all trapped in a machine that cared little for truth, and he vowed that his second chance would not be wasted on silence. He would speak not only for himself, but for others who might never have their loyalty tested by something as undeniable as a growl. The next morning he awoke early, stepping outside to feel the crisp air of dawn, and Shadow trotted beside him, free of leash, bounding across the grass with a joy that mirrored his own. Malcolm Carter's first days of freedom felt both overwhelming and fragile, as though the air itself carried more weight than his lungs could hold. And while Shadow bounded happily at his side as if no time had passed, Malcolm carried within him 7 years of silence, grief, and reflection, a weight he could never fully shed but could now transform into something more meaningful. Supporters rallied around him, civil rights groups reached out, and media clamored for interviews, but Malcolm remained grounded in the truth that his story was not about spectacle, but about survival, dignity, and the loyalty of a dog whose instincts had unearthed a lie buried deep within the machinery of injustice. Each morning he woke with the rising sun, savoring the feel of sheets not tucked into a prison cot, the sound of Shadow's nails clicking across the wooden floor of the small home he had been given, and the taste of freedom that came with each unshackled breath. Yet every quiet moment reminded him of what had been lost. Years he could never recover, memories with his mother stolen, time he should have spent building a life instead of fighting for the right to live. Still, Malcolm refused to drown in bitterness, because bitterness would only chain him to the walls he had left behind. Instead, he chose to transform pain into purpose, speaking at community meetings where young men looked at him with wide eyes, some seeing themselves in his story, some realizing for the first time that the system was not infallible. And in those moments, Malcolm understood that his survival carried power beyond his own name. Shadow never left his side during these talks, often lying at his feet as if to remind the audience that truth had not been delivered by paperwork alone, but by loyalty, instinct, and the refusal of a faithful companion to let lies stand unchallenged. The bond between man and dog became a living symbol of what justice often lacked: unconditional trust that transcended prejudice. Malcolm also worked with attorneys and advocacy groups, determined to expose how Briggs's lies had been allowed to pass unchallenged, how bias had silenced his voice in the courtroom, and how many others still sat where he once sat, innocent but unheard. Briggs, awaiting his trial, faded into obscurity as his crimes became undeniable, and though Malcolm did not rejoice in the man's downfall, he accepted it as necessary, a reminder that accountability, however delayed, was still possible. For Malcolm, the most meaningful victory was not Briggs's arrest, but his own chance to live as the man Shadow had always believed him to be. On a quiet afternoon months after his release, Malcolm walked with Shadow through a park lined with oak trees, their branches swaying gently in the breeze, and as children laughed in the distance and strangers passed with polite smiles, he felt the simple beauty of ordinary life, something denied to him for so long. He sat on a bench, Shadow's head resting on his lap, and he whispered, "We made it out, boy, but we didn't just survive, we proved that truth doesn't die." Shadow thumped his tail against the ground as if in agreement, and Malcolm let the moment stretch, the sun warming his face, the world finally welcoming him back. He knew the years stolen could never be returned, but he also knew that his future was his to shape, and he vowed to spend it ensuring others would not endure what he had, because to remain silent would dishonor the loyalty that had saved his life. The end of his sentence was not the end of his story, it was the beginning of a mission to show that justice must be more than words, that it must be lived, fought for, and defended even when the odds stand impossibly high. Malcolm Carter, once condemned, now free, walked forward into a world that had nearly forgotten him, carrying with him the living proof that love and loyalty could break chains no court would, and that sometimes the truest advocate was not a lawyer or a judge, but a dog who remembered. The end. If this story touched you, make sure to subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to hear it. I'd love to know what you think about the twists in Malcolm's journey. Did the ending surprise you, or did you sense it building from the start? Tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Your thoughts really help shape the stories we bring next. And don't forget to hit that like button if you want to see more powerful tales like this.